Okay, so now that we've fixed up a few of the bugs we were having, it's now time to go on to actually adding some more things to the game. So the first thing we're going to look at is one of the most basic parts of any kind of platformer, which is killing the player and making them restart at an earlier point, at a checkpoint or the start of the level, whichever kind of suits your own game, whichever way you want to do it. So what we need to do is, if we switch back to the scene view here, rather than just, before we go and create any kind of danger areas like spikes on the ground or anything like that, at the most basic level we want something along the bottom of the screen that will kill the player as soon as the player touches against it, and then they'll get reset back to wherever they're going to. So the most easy way to do that is to basically just create a box at the bottom of the screen that the player will run into and get reset. So what we're going to do is create a new object here. We're going to create empty, and we're going to call this the kill plane. So this will be the area where our player gets killed and dies. And before we move it or anything like that, what we want to do is add a box collider to it, much like we did with our platforms and with our player. We want to go to add component here. We're going to type in our box collider 2D, and we see it's automatically been added over here. But we want to make this really wide so that it covers up a whole load of area. So we'll bring this up to about, say, 50. So it's really wide, but it's not, if we look at it there now, it's not wide enough to cover the whole game or anything like that. So what we want to do is make sure that this box can follow along with us as we move along through the game. And the way we could do that, of course, if we made it follow the player, for example, but then if we made it follow the player, it would just move down with the player and the player would never hit it. But we have something else that is following the player the whole time, which is the camera. And we know the camera is only traveling along in a straight line along with the player. So if we put this box below the camera, we know that the player can fall down below the camera, but it can still hit this box below us. So what we're going to do is make this kill plane a child of the main camera, like that. And then we're going to move it into position down below. So down below here, a little bit out of the way, because we want to make sure that the player will drop completely off the screen before they disappear. So actually even lower than that. So we know that there's plenty of space between the bottom of where the camera is, and we know that the player won't be visible in this area basically. So down the bottom here we have this little box. So at the moment what will happen, if we were to run the game here like this, we start moving, and if we drop the player off the edge, obviously to go out of the screen, but if we turn back to the scene view, the player just lands on this box like this. So that's no good to us. So what we need to do, we're going to make this into what's called a trigger zone. And the way we do that is literally just a tiny little button here. We just make sure that is trigger is selected. So what that does is this makes this box, it's not hittable. The player won't hit off the box, but when he passes into the area, it becomes like a zone that gets activated when the player enters it basically. So again, I'll show an example. If we walk off the edge here, like this, and I'll just pause it. So in our scene view, if we hit this little button to move on one frame at a time like this, we'll see the player drop down and just drop straight through the box like that. But when he goes through that box, he's actually doing a thing called, he's entering a trigger, is what it's called, which is fairly self-explanatory. There's 3 states. You can be entering the trigger, you can be staying in the trigger, or you can be leaving the trigger. Fairly self-explanatory, obviously. But now that we have this box that's a child of the camera, this box is following along with us through the whole area. It'll be always there to catch our player when they fall and to reset our game. So now we need to set it up so that we can actually do stuff with this trigger area. And how we do that is obviously by using the script for the player controller. So we go into our scripts folder and we'll open our player controller script here. Okay, so once our script is open, what we're going to do is add a new kind of function to our script, and it's a built-in function within Unity that we haven't come across just yet, but it's fairly simple and fairly straightforward too. So by default, Unity has void start built into our scripts, and we have void update built into the script. And they're 2 default things that Unity can use so that it knows when to create certain actions. So we know that the start here takes place at the very first moment. We know that our update happens every time the screen ticks over into a new frame, basically. And there's a few other ones as well. There's fixed update, which happens at a set interval in time for handling some kind of physics stuff and stuff like that. And there's an awake one as well for when you make an object active. We'll cover those things in the future, but there's some other default things that are very useful as well. So if we go down here, so much like we have a void update here, if we go below this curly bracket but above the last curly bracket, so we'll just make some space here. So as I said, much like void update, what we're going to type here is void on trigger enter 2 and then a capital D. So what this is basically, as I said, there's 3 states for these trigger boxes here. We can have when we're entering a trigger, when we're staying in a trigger, or when we're leaving a trigger. So we can have, so there's 3 different functions that will tie into that here as well. So we've got on trigger enter here. There's also on trigger stay and on trigger exit, like that. But we're only concerned with on trigger enter, because what we want to know is if the player goes into this trigger area, then we need the game to do something so that it will reset the player, or whatever else we want to do on some other trigger areas as well. So the way on trigger enter 2D works within Unity is within this bracket that we need to type in here. So much like up here on our void update, we put just an empty bracket like that, and that's because it's a function. So a function needs to have these kind of open and close brackets. But unlike the update and the start function here, we need to actually put something inside here so that the script knows what to do with it. So inside here, we're going to type in collider 2D other. So what's happening is our player controller script is obviously attached to our player, and when he falls down, he runs into the trigger box down here. So what we're saying here is we're detecting whenever any kind of trigger enters whatever object our player controller script is attached to, and within the brackets we're saying whatever the other collider 2D, so the collider 2D other, so whatever other collider, and we know that our kill plane here is a box collider, so whatever other collider we come into, that's the collider that we're going to be talking about with our on trigger enter here. So we'll put some curly brackets here now, because again, much like with our start function and our update function, we have the void at the start, we have what the name of the thing is. With our update and start, we have a blank open and close brackets like that, because we don't need them to tell us that we don't need to specifically talk about any object there. And then we have our open and close curly brackets, because that's where we do all our coding in between. So inside this bracket, we're simply going to be checking to see what kind of box we walked into here. So we could have a whole load of different triggers in the world. Say we have this trigger here for killing our player, but later on the level we could have, say, a trigger box here for saying, okay, this is the end of the level. If the player gets to here, you win. But for now, we're only dealing with this one box. So we need a unique way to be able to tell what kind of box we have walked into down here. So there's a couple of ways we could do that. We could check by the name of the object, but then we have to make sure that in every level we make in the game, we call our kill plane the exact same thing. So instead, what we're going to use are tags that are built into the game. So much like before when we set a layer for the ground so that we would know what the ground was, we could set a layer for this, but that creates extra problems and it's a little harder to code for our trigger enter zones down here. What's way more simple and way more straightforward is to use tags. And we can see up here we've got a tag as a default component within the inspector. So every object again in the world has a tag, a layer, and a transform basically. So if we go back to our kill plane, if we hit the tag drop down here, we can see we've got a few built-in tags like that, but they're not the ones we would really want to use. So we're going to add a new tag. We're going to hit there, and then we get this little drop down here, but there's nothing in it yet. So we'll hit the little plus symbol, and we're just going to call this the kill plane, like that. And then we go back to our kill plane, and we go in here, and we'll select that as the tag we're going to use for when the player runs into it. And while we're here, we might as well set on the player back here, we want to set his tag to be player as well, because in the future we're probably going to want to use that at some point, but for now we're happy we're only working with the kill plane here. So now we've set that tag. If we go back to our script, we just need to check that the other object that we're about to fall into has that tag. So we can just say if, and then other. We're saying other because it's the collider other that we're going into. Now we could call this whatever we want. We could call this boots. It doesn't matter. Whatever we want to call it, we could just say down here we want to check for boots, and then we want to check for what the tag is on it. But we're just gonna, a very common kind of way of doing this is to write other here, so we know we're talking about the other object that we're running into. So if the other dot tag is equal to, and when you're writing equal to in an if statement, you need to make sure you write two equals symbols, because within Unity, if you write one equal symbol, you're setting something to be worth a value. So here, for example, back up here in our get button down here, when we're pressing when we're setting myRigid.velocity to be equal to this new vector, we use one equal sign because we're saying this thing on the left should be equal to this thing on the right. But when we want to check something, we want to say this thing over here, the other.tag, is that equal to whatever we want here. And obviously the thing we want to put in here is the name of the tag that we created for the kill plane. So we want to type in between quotation marks, we want to say kill plane, like that. And again, much like we had with the animator and with the input stuff, you want to make sure that all of this is spelled the exact same and capitalized the exact same, so that it all makes sense within the game. Okay, so we'll put a little close bracket there. So now we're saying if the other tag is the kill plane, then we need to be able to do something there. And just to keep it nice and simple to start out with, for now we're just going to make it deactivate the player so we can no longer play anymore. So we'll just say here game object, so we know we're talking about the game object that this script is attached to. Game object dot set active, and then in brackets false. So what we're doing is saying the game object that our player controller script is attached to, we want to set that to not be active anymore, basically. So if we go back in here, we'll save that and go back in here. If we zoom in here a little bit, this little checkbox up here controls whether any particular object is active or not. So if I were to turn that off there, our player disappears from the world and we wouldn't be able to do anything with him if we ran the game, but it's not deleted from the scene or anything like that. It's just deactivated, so it's not being used for the time. But we can turn that back on very simply like that. So what we're going to be doing now, if we run the game like this, and if you keep your eye on the player listing in the hierarchy here, when we walk over the edge, we fall down and we see the player gets deactivated. And now in the game, if we move left or right or anything like that, the camera isn't moving. Because I didn't actually show this beforehand, but if we are just to deactivate the kill plane here and we hit play, at the moment with the way the game is set up, if we were to walk over the edge like this, now if we were to move left or right, the camera is moving around while the player is falling down into infinity. If we click on the player, we can see they're falling away forever and ever. So that's why we want our kill plane to catch the player when they fall and then reset our stuff back into the world. Okay, so now we've added the basic functionality of hitting that kill plane and creating an action that will stop our player being active. So the next thing, we need to create a way for our player to have a point to go back to within our world. And that's where we're going to take a look at checkpoints.